everybody, hope you're doing great today. This week we're going to be jumping into our next set of big topics, which is formal language. Before we do that, as always though, let's go ahead and recap a bit of what we've looked at so far. So the general idea of what we've done so far is just going back to the way beginning. We started talking about just what is logic, and the idea was we're after good inferences, right? Good ways of going from some initial set of information to some sort of new conclusion or result or new information. And the idea is we started looking at different ways in which we could think about what an argument is or what an inference is, and we could talk about, well, one, where did you start from when you were trying to infer, right? What was the evidence itself that you were inferring from, right? And we can ask, were those premises true, right? Was that initial evidence true? And then we could ask, now set aside, if it is true, would the conclusion follow, right? What is the connection between the premises and the conclusion, right? And that's that validity question. And it turns out validity is really what we care about in logic, right? As we saw last week, validity turns out to be just about the structure of the argument, the structure of the inference, right? On the left here, we had a whole bunch of valid arguments because they all followed the same structure, right? Where we said, well, A leads to B, right? If A were true, B would have to be true. A is true, therefore B is true, right? And as we see in each one of these, they all have that same structure, and so, right, they're all in the same way valid. We wouldn't be able to reject this conclusion unless we were okay with rejecting one of these premises, right? The premises together would entail the conclusion. Compare that to something like these two, right? These have just a different form, right? We can see that the B's and the A here are swapped with the conclusion and the second premise. And the idea is with both of these, even if you accept the premises, that doesn't mean you have to accept the conclusion. Now, again, for more recap, I would definitely recommend going back to those videos if that's not sinking in quite well yet. But moving forward, right, as we were seeing, it turns out that it's the structure that becomes really important. It's not that we care about dealing with humans or mortals or H2O or memory or whatever, right? Any of the content of any of these arguments, it really can't matter, just that we had a specific structure. And so this week and over the next few weeks, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be trying to really build that structure. We're going to be trying to develop a formal language that allows us to capture the relationships between these statements, right? Like when we say, if A is true, then B is true, and that sort of thing. So to do that, let's go ahead and bring in some of our pieces here. To do that, we're going to have three general sets of things that are going to help us. Okay, these are going to be the three pieces of our language here, right? So first, just like you already saw us using a bit above, we're going to be using A, B, and C, as well as P, Q, R, S, right? Any sort of capital letter, to be clear. We're going to be using these just to stand for individual statements, right? So the idea is, now I'll bring up an example. So for these variables, here's an example, and I'll go ahead and maybe give this a little bit of color over here. Right, R, we can say just is the statement, it is raining. Okay, C is just the statement, it is cold. So when we write one of these letters, basically what we're saying is this is standing in place of that entire statement, right? It's not just standing in place of the object or anything like that. It's saying, hey, if I write down D, I'm saying the door is open, okay? And now, this is going to be a little bit, this might be a little bit confusing at this point because it's like, well, what do you mean when you just write down a letter? That's what you're saying. But as we go, we'll start to see. Just to flash back to what we were doing last time, that's basically what we were doing here, right? We were saying, well, premise 2, in this case, it's just, it is raining, right? And so when I just write A, it's just the same thing as me writing, it is raining, right? I'm saying, if it is raining, then B, the ground is wet, right? A, the ground, it is raining, therefore B, the ground is wet. So that's what I mean when I say those letters just are going to stand in for the particular statements. Okay, now here we had just these A and B, and we were showing how the same pattern works for all of these. But the idea is, when we're really getting going in our language, we're just going to attach a single letter to a single statement, right? We're not going to attach A to all of these purple statements. Each one of these is going to get a different letter. And that's what we're working on this week. So what we want to do is we want to just think about all of our statements. We're just going to say, all right, we're just going to capture those each. We're going to represent each of those with just a single statement. So anytime we want to talk about a particular statement, that's totally fair to do. We just need to assign it a letter so that way we know we're clear about it, right? So if I wanted to add to this something like, let's say I wanted to add to this a statement like, the door is closed, right? The idea is I wouldn't just use D again for door, right? I would want to use another letter because this is just its own statement. This is a different statement than the first one, right? So I would want to give it its own letter. Like, I mean, right now all the obvious choices have been taken by other sentences, so maybe I'll just choose something. Well, R is chosen. O, let's do O. Right. Okay, so that's generally the idea when we're talking about statements. Now, in this case, however, you might think, well, that's going to get really annoying if, like, we have the door is open here, and then the door is closed is really just the opposite of that, right? To say the door is closed, that's really just to say the door is not open. And so really what we're going to do in our language is instead of adding that new letter for this new statement, the door is closed, really what we're going to do is we're just going to say something like, well, the door is not open. Or let me say it like this. It's not the case that the door is open. Right? And if I want to try to say this more complicated thing, the idea is I'm going to use my operators here. So the idea is we have these basic building blocks, these like atomic sentences you can think of them as, that's what we'll call them, right? Just these singular, it just says one little thing. And then what we can do is we'll use these symbols here to build up more complicated statements. So in this case, all that I'm doing is I'm saying it's not the case that D is true, right? So like this is the same as saying it's not the case that D, right? Like that's the same sentence, right? I'm saying it's not the case that D. It's not the case that the door is open, right? And that's going to be the same, actually. Let me just add to the top. The door right, all of these sentences here are equivalent. And that's all I mean, by the way, with this 3-barred equal sign. This is just a special type of equal sign that stands between propositions. If you want to learn more about it, again, it's explained a little bit more in the lecture notes, but I don't want to get too sidetracked on this. We can just think about this as essentially saying these propositions are saying the same thing, right? So when we say the door is closed, we're saying it's not the case that the door is open. That's the same thing as saying it's not the case that D, because D is just, well, the door is open. So at this point, right, let's look at, okay, so what are these symbols actually doing for us? Like what can we do with these? And so the idea is that we have this chart here, right? So I'll put it right here for now. So we have 5 symbols, and each of these are going to let us build a slightly more complicated statement, right? So first, we have this little, we call this a negation symbol, and the idea is anytime we want to just say something is not the case, then we just add that negation symbol to the front of it, right? So just like if you have this statement P, you can just put the negation in front. Here it's a tilde because the code didn't work right. And that just means you're saying P is not true. Okay, so the idea is if I wanted to say it is not the case that D, or similarly, right, this is just saying that D is not true, right? These are all different ways of saying the same English sentence. Well, then I can just say not D. right? These are all saying the same exact thing. They're all saying that the door is not open, that the door is closed, right? It is not true that the door is open. It is not the case that the door is open. The door being open is not true, right? Like, these are all different ways of just saying the door is closed. And the point here, though, is that we're starting off with just a single little atomic statement, and we don't add a new statement when we want to say it's not true. What we do is we use this little negation operator, right? And so the idea is it's the same sort of thing if I wanted to say, well, either the door is open or it's cold outside, right? So let's say I had that. So let me take this over here. What if I said either the door is closed, let's say open, just to make it easier, or it is cold outside. Right? Again, I don't want to just add, I'm not just going to add a new letter for this, like just to, right? I don't want to just add a new letter to this, because if I do this, if I just add a new letter to everything, like if I added a new letter for the door is closed, then I'm going to miss the relationships between these things, right? Like, the fact is, believing that the door is open, believing D is going to relate to Z somehow. And like, it'd be nice if we could represent that somehow in the language itself, right? If we could represent that this isn't just some simple statement, it's actually a complicated statement built up out of smaller, littler statements, right? So the idea is, instead of just giving it its own letter, when we have any sort of complicated statements, we always want to build it out of our atomic statements. So in this case, the idea is, well, let's still say either, but now I have a letter for this. Either the door is open, so either D, or what? It is cold outside, C. Right? So here I'm saying either D or C is true, right? Like, that's what this statement is saying. And the idea is that's exactly what this disjunction is telling us. It's saying, so whenever we use this wedge, whenever we put this wedge in between, this little V in between two letters like P and Q, then we're saying, well, I'm not sure which one is true, but one of them is going to be true, right? We're saying either P is true or Q is true, right? If you're saying, hey, I don't know who's going to win that game, right? It's either going to be the home team or the away team, right? I'm not saying it's both teams, but I'm saying it's either going to be one or it's going to be the other. That's the point of this disjunction. So, right, this just is, we'll represent this as just D or C, right? And that's how we read this. So I say read this as D or C, like when we really start getting into the language, right, we'll get further and further from just using the English translation. We'll get more and more comfortable with trying to just say these things just naturally. So like this one, for instance, right, we would just read this as not D. Okay. So that's the idea, right? We're starting with these basic pieces, and we're creating more complicated statements out of the basic pieces. So we can do one thing, we can reject, right? We can say something is not true, right? So if for any statement we have, for any statement for each of these, we would give each of these a different letter, right? John breaks the law, right? Maybe we would say that's L, he will be punished is P. And the idea is that with each of those statements, if I just say not J or not P, not L, then I'm just saying John didn't break the law or John isn't being punished. Again, we're going to be looking at more examples in a moment. Right, and so in the same thing with just the or. Anytime I just put two letters together and I put that V in between them, I'm just saying, well, I'm not sure which one is true. I'm just saying one of these guys is true. Okay, so now conjunction is going to be really similar to disjunction, except as you might expect, it's going to not say either one of these is true, but it's going to say both are true, right? When I say that P and Q are true, I'm saying P is true and Q is true. So the idea is if I wanted to say something, right, like it is, um, yeah, it is raining outside or it is cold, something like that. I'm thinking maybe I should give these different colors now. It is raining and it's cold. Right? That's just going to be the same thing as saying, well, R is what we use for raining, and then we say and C. But again, that's all the dot means. All we're going to use this dot for is just to say R and C. Right? Whenever we put the dot in between two letters, we're saying both of those things are true. Okay. So these are just, again, I just want to, this is, might seem obvious at this point. This might seem really confusing at this point. Like this, people are very varied at this point at this point in the class. But like the idea here is just to get start getting used to this idea that we have these atomic pieces. Anytime you're asked to do a translation, you're going to be given these atomic pieces, and then we just need to put them together in the right way to form the sentence we want to form. Okay, I will just go ahead and at least alternate these colors so that there's a little bit of easier to see. Okay, so let's do that. All right, so now let's look at one more. Oh, I don't know that really worked out. Let's look at our conditional. So we'll say if, right? So this conditional here is saying if I put an arrow in between two things, I'm saying if one is true, then the other thing follows, right? So like if it's wet outside, then it is cold, or maybe like if it's raining, then it's wet outside, or then it's wet on the ground, or something like that, right? So we could say, if I want to say, if it is raining, then the ground is wet. And so I could say, again, I'm just going to go ahead and copy this sentence down. But now I'm just going to replace the pieces that I have letters for, right? So it is raining. I've got a letter for that. I can say, well, okay, so if R, and then I can replace this piece that I also have a letter for. The ground is wet, right? I can say, well, that's just W, right? So I'm saying if R, then W. And that's exactly what the arrow is supposed to capture. It's just capturing this idea that if R is true, then W should be true, right? Whenever we write R, then W like this, we're saying if R is true, W has to be true. We're not saying if W has to be true, then R has to be true, but just, right, it's the other way around. And that directionality is going to be really important. So in this case, we can read this in a number of different ways, right? We can say if R, then W. Another way to say this is to say R only if W. This one can confuse people saying it like this, R only if W, because sometimes people want to switch it around and think that means W arrow R. But the idea is, right, if I say, right, you're playing basketball only if you own a basketball, right, only if you have a basketball. First of all, that sounds right? Like you can only play basketball if you have a basketball. Well, that means if I see you playing basketball, then it must mean that you own a basketball, right? Playing basketball only if having a basketball means the one being true entails the other being true. So I'm saying this now, right, because this is going to be, it's a common thing to get confused on. I'll be bringing this up a few times over the semester just so that we can try to get better and better at it. But the point here is we want to be very careful about what the directionality is of our arrow. Okay. And then finally, we have this biconditional. So let me go ahead and I'll change that one's color. And so we can just go ahead and take this. And we will say Well, suppose that any time it's cold outside, the light is on. Let's say, like, suppose we're living in a lighthouse or something like that, right? So if I say, anytime it's cold outside, or it's cold outside, any and every time that the light is on. Well, right, I'm saying that there's never a time. Here, let me make this more clear. It's cold outside. I guess I'll use the same. Okay, changed it just slightly here. So let's say we have this statement. It's cold outside if and only if it is raining. So this last thing is, we're saying if it's cold outside, then it's raining, right? But also, if it's raining, then it's cold outside, right? We're saying it goes both ways here, right? The only time it's cold outside is when it's raining. The only time it's raining is when it's cold outside. And that's specifically what this double arrow is about. So, right, like, the idea is that the single arrow just tells you that one side causes the other. And the point of the double arrow is to tell you that, well, no, both sides cause each other, right? Like, if you know one side happens, you know the other side has to happen. So for the single arrow, if I know that W is true, if I know the ground is wet, that does not justify to me that it's raining, right? That's not what this sentence is telling me. This sentence is telling me that if you know it's raining, then you know the ground is wet. But the other direction doesn't work. The point of the double arrow is to say, no, both directions work, right? So if I said it's cold outside, if and only if it's raining, then I'm saying if it's raining, it's going to be cold. And if it's cold, it's going to be raining. Again, this might not actually be true in the real world, right? Like, maybe we have some summer showers. But, like, that's the point of what this statement is trying to say. It's trying to say the only time it's cold is when it's raining. And the only time it's raining is when it's cold. So we have this biconditional, this double direction, this double arrow here. So the idea is we would just say, for cold, right, we have C. For raining, we have R. So we would just say C, double arrow R. And we read this just as C, if and only if R. Okay, so the idea is, right, C only if R would just be capturing one direction, right? Like, that's what's going on up here. We have R only if W. That's saying R, arrow W. So, like, C, if I just had C only if R, I would just be having the one direction. It's this other if, and again, you can read more about this in the lecture notes, that gives us this other direction that says, no, and if R is true, then C is true, right? That other arrow direction holds. Okay, so all of this, right, again, might be feeling kind of weird, kind of murky at this point. It's not clear, like, what are we doing with all of this? Hopefully you're getting some sense of, like, okay, this little guy is something about not and, like, negation. This V is about or. This dot is about and. This arrow is about an if-then. And this biconditional is about, right, like an if-then that goes both ways. So, right, like, hopefully you're getting a bit of a sense of that. But now we're gonna try to really hone that and work on that with some more examples. So, like, let's look. So let me first. We'll look at this punctuation thing later on. This will be more important as we start to get more complicated statements. For right now, it doesn't really matter. You can just think about the parentheses are going to play the same role that parentheses do in math or in essentially anything else, right? They're just going to help us group things together. But these are the pieces of our language that we need to work with. So let's look at a few basic examples of these. So, and I will move my little note about this means defines up there. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at, I'll copy our word bank and bring it down here. let's try to go through each of these and see if we can translate them, right? That's all we want to do at this stage, is be able to excuse me, translate what each of these statements are saying from English into logic and from logic into English. So now is probably a good time, especially like if you're not feeling, if you want that extra practice, to pause and see if you can do this yourself, right? For each one of these, see if you can translate these logic sentences. What are they trying to say in English? And then how would we take these English statements and how would we put them into logic, into our logic language? Okay, let's go ahead and get started. So, let's see. I'll go ahead and just to, hopefully this will keep it cleaner, I'm going to go ahead and just create a separate column over here. And I'll even just color this slightly differently. Okay. So the idea is with each of these, all that I'm going to do is I'm just going to think about, all right, what are the letters picking out, right? And how are they being combined with the particular symbols? So what I like to do when I do these sorts of things is, well, first of all, if all I had was a letter, right? If all I had was just something like W, well then your job is essentially done, right? You just go over to the list and you say, oh, W just means the ground is wet. So I'm just going to take the ground is wet. Oops. And I'm just going to say, well, that's all the W means. The ground is wet. Right? And then we would be done. That is in fact all that W would mean. So you would be done. But so let's get past those just the atomic statements, and let's think, okay, so how would I translate something like this? And the idea is that what we're going to do is let's start off with the operator. Let's think about what each of these operators, what each of these connectives are saying. By the way, we use the term operator and connective just interchangeably here. So here, this tilde, let's think, what is the tilde, or what does the negation sign mean? I call it a tilde because in other classes, as you see up here, we use just a simple tilde symbol. So the idea is it just means it is not the case. Right? Okay, cool. Step one done. I'll even make this. So here I've translated that symbol, and now the next step is, okay, let's translate the R. So I come over here and I ask, okay, what does R mean? It just means it is raining. So I'll come over here and I'll just substitute R with just literally, and to make my point, I'll literally just copy and paste it, just R. It's not the case that it is raining. Sometimes, so this is a perfectly good sentence. Is not the case it is raining. Sometimes as we translate, it'll be good. You'll feel where some extra English words can just help that sentence flow. We never want to change the meaning when we do that, but yeah. So, and let me go ahead and change this color scheme here. So right, that's how we translate that first statement. We just say start with the symbol, or start with the connective, right? That tells us that, and then, right, that tells us essentially like the structure of the statement. This will be more clear as we go. And then we just, okay, plug in, for each of those atomic sentences that are left over, plug in what do they actually mean. All right, so let's get going. So here we have R or V, right? So we're going to replace that or with what it means, right? We're saying R or V means either R or V, or excuse me, or C. Sorry about that. Right? That's all we mean by that. That's all that sentence means. In fact, I'll go ahead and take this. Either R or C. And now all I need to do is I need to go in and I just need to think, okay, so what does R mean? It means it is raining. Either it is raining or it is cold. Right? That's all that second sentence means. So hopefully that's starting to make a little bit of sense. I'm doing that like really, that might almost feel a little too slow in some ways. So let's just try to think about it, right? We might do this next one intuitively, right? If I say L and D, what I'm saying is two things are true. L is true and D is true. So, right, I'm just saying L, it means the light is on, and D, the door is open. So, right, I can just come here and I'll say the light is on and the door is open. And now to be good English grammar, I should put commas in between my clauses. Right? And just working backwards a little bit, I can see like that's all that was happening here, right? I'm just saying two things are true, L and D. That's all that's happening with that statement. Right? Moving on, we have if R then W, right? We can say R only if W here. We can also just say if R then W, right? This is going to be probably the most natural way to be doing it, by the way, as you're trying to translate these sentences. And now I can go along. I can say, okay, well, so what I'm trying to say is if it is raining, then the ground is wet, right? So if R then W, and I know now that it is raining. Actually, let me just grab. Oh, wrong one. Then the ground is wet. And I don't have that one there yet. Okay. And then finally, right, we have our biconditional. So we're saying L is true if and only if D is true. So we say L is true if and only if, right? We're just going to sub that double arrow out with just this if and only if phrase. And then that makes the rest of the translation really straightforward, right? All we're just going to say is, so we're going to take what we just made there, we're going to put this here, and then we're going to say, okay, now all I need to do is substitute L for what it means, the light is on, if and only if the door is open. Right? So as we're going, it can be really it can be intimidating when you see just a set of symbols and letters and things like that, and you think like, just what am I supposed to do with it? Alternatively, you might already be feeling like really confident, and you're like, wow, that was much slower than it needed to be. Like, yeah, you should just be flying through that. But the reason why I do that is pretty soon we're going to be getting into more complicated statements, right? Notice there's multiple symbols in a single statement, and then even more complicated statements still, right? Where we have more and more things going on. So the point of all this is just to slow it down, right? Just to say like, okay, like you don't have to do it. This is going to be really common in this class where you're going to want to, like your brain is going to be wanting to take care of multiple steps at once, but doing so is always going to be more risky than it's worth, and it's typically just going to be the wrong way to do things, right? You need to just slow down and just think like, okay, well, just do this first. What does that symbol mean? Okay, now plug in the other things that I know, right? Plug in my symbols for my atomic letters, right? So it'll be valuable just to be like approaching this slowly as we get going, especially for those of us that aren't feeling terribly confident quite yet. Just let's go with this slowly. And for those of us that are feeling maybe too confident, also maybe just slow it down a little bit, because sometimes that's exactly what can lead us into some trouble later on. But anyway, let's go ahead and go on with our English to logic statements here. So basically when I do English to logic, I'm going to do the reverse, right? I'm going to say, okay, I've got English, and now how do I get all the way over to logic? So I'll keep this as black, but I'll choose another color scheme for the next. Let's just do green here. Or actually, no, I will match the color schemes. So this English we have decided is this gold, and we're trying to move it back into this black over here. Okay, so the idea is, right, we have this statement, it is not cold, and what we want to do is we want to try to think, okay, so what are the operators involved here? And then what are the atomic variables involved, right? What are the statements that are involved? And then what are the connectives or the operators that are doing something to those statements? So what I would always recommend you do is, just like before, I find it always easier to work with the operator first, right? Try to figure out just what is the logical symbol that I need to use and squeeze out the English until you know, okay, no, that is the core little piece of atomic sentence that I need to work with. So in this case, right, I'm going to say, okay, it is not cold. Really, what you're telling me is you're telling me you have this statement, it is cold, and you're just saying it's not the case that that thing is cold, right? And I know, right, it is cold is just my thing C, so I can just say it is not the case that C. Or here, right, the light is on or the door is open. All that I'm going to do to start off is I'm just going to put the V in place of the or, right? Just so I can see, okay, what I'm doing is I'm saying either the light is on the left or the door is open on the right. So, right, I can come over here, and again, I'll just copy that word over here. And I know, okay, now all I have to do is I just need to substitute the light is on for its letter, L, and then the door is open for its letter, D. And then I'm good. Right? At this stage, you might be thinking like, well, why am I doing the letter or the symbols before the letters or vice versa? And like, there's not necessarily a hard and fast rule. So like, it is okay like that if you feel like you're doing them both at the same time to some extent at this point. But as we go again and we start looking at these more complicated statements, it's going to be really useful for us just to lay out, okay, let me just get my symbol there first, my connective there first, and then I'll still start building the rest of it. So it's a good idea to try, even though these might seem a little simple for you, try to identify what those main operators are for first, or what these operators are. Okay, it is raining and it is cold, right? This is just an and statement. So right over here I can say, all right, it is raining and it is cold, so I'm just going to substitute that for its letter R, and it is cold for its letter C. Don't need periods. Right? The door is open, then the light is on, right? If the door is open, then the light is on. I know that, okay, if I just want to do a conditional, then all I'm doing is I'm taking this if then away, and I'm just putting an arrow in between them. Right? I'm saying if this door is open, then the light is on. So that means all that I'm doing is I'm saying the light is on is a consequence of the door being open. Right? And then finally, again, if and only if, I know that's just a double arrow. And so when I take this, so I can substitute that, and I know, okay, on the left side, all I'm saying is just the ground is wet. So I can just substitute that. And then on the right side, I can just say it is raining. I can substitute that, and I'm good. Okay. So that's how we go back and forth between logic and English, right? It's typically, again, like with these basic statements, and hopefully you get to the point where it does become second nature for you just to intuitively read across, and you don't need to like stop and start like, okay, well, first I have this connective and then I have these letters. Ideally, you should be able to get to the point where you're just saying, yeah, L and D are both true. The light is on and the door is open. But the reason why I slow it down this much is because as we get going, like as I keep warning you about, we're going to be dealing with much more complicated statements. So like a statement like this, for instance, if it is raining and it is cold, then the ground is wet and the light is on, right? We don't want to just try to do that all at once. Like, even that one, you might be feeling like, I think I could do it. I think I could do that at once. But, like, these get more and more and more and more complicated. And the whole point of this class is to stop relying on just, like, your intuition and your gut feelings about these things and learn how to just use the rigorous process we're going to be building in order to actually figure out what's going on. So, as we go, try to be careful to start off with thinking about what the connectives are, and then be thinking about plugging in those specific sentence variables and what they mean. But in general, as we go, it'll be good to keep getting more and more familiar with these sorts of things. Okay, take care out there. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and see you next time.